Christopher Lane, better known as Chris, was born in the city of Melbourne. Melbourne is a city with over 5 million inhabitants, making it one of the most populous and important cities in Australia. He was the youngest child of Donna Lane and Peter Lane. The couple already had 3 daughters, so for them, the arrival of Chris was seen as a missing piece to complete the family. Chris was described as a cheerful, playful boy who matured very early. Since he was a little boy, he was very fond of sports, but it was in baseball that he found his passion. Chris was so good at baseball that when he was in high school, he was offered a scholarship to play for a professional high school team in Oklahoma. Furthermore, if he accepted this proposal, he would still have a guaranteed scholarship at East Central University, where he would also play baseball on the professional team at that institution. At first, Chris's parents were reluctant to let their son, who was still a minor, go to the United States alone. However, they saw how happy Chris was with the opportunity and knew that the boy would have more chances to fulfill his dream of becoming a professional baseball player if he went to the United States, which is considered the birthplace of the sport. So Chris's parents allowed him to go to the United States to pursue his dream. Upon arriving in the new country, Chris went on to study and play on the professional baseball team at the school he had won the scholarship. And it was at that same school that he met the young woman he fell in love with, named Sarah Harper, who would become his girlfriend. Sarah later stated during an interview that at first she had no interest in dating Chris, but as he was very determined and persistent, she decided to give it a chance and ended up liking him very much. So much so that after they started a relationship, they didn't break up more. After finishing high school, as scheduled, Chris went to study and play baseball at East Central University in Ada, Oklahoma. With that, the boy had to move to the city of Ada to be able to attend the university. According to friends and family of the boy, Chris was very happy. Everything was going well in his life, and he felt he was getting closer to living his dream. Sarah, Chris's girlfriend, also had to move, but she went to the city of Duncan, which is also in Oklahoma, since she passed the university that is located there. The city of Duncan is about an hour away from the city of Ada, where Chris lived. So whenever he could or when he didn't have classes at college, he traveled to Duncan to be with Sarah as long as he could. On August 16, 2013, Chris, then 22 years old, was spending a few days at Sarah's house. It is said that he woke up early, even before Sarah, got ready, and went for a run as he used to do every day. The town of Duncan where Sarah lived is small, with just over 22,000 inhabitants, and is considered one of the most peaceful and quiet places in the state of Oklahoma, where crime rates are very low. In this way, Chris believed he was safe and could safely run around the city, but unfortunately he was wrong. Around 9 a.m., a woman identified as Mrs. Smith was returning to her house when she saw a young man staggering and fell into his face in the middle of the road. Quickly, she parked the car on the side of the road and walked over to see if he was alright. Upon approaching, the woman noticed that he had blood on his mouth and thought that he had been injured by the fall, but when trying to help him, she saw that he had a hole in his back. A couple who were working nearby heard a loud bang and decided to go to the road to see what caused the noise. Once on the road, they saw Mrs. Smith stopped and they thought that the tire of her car had burst and they went to help. But as soon as they approached, they saw that there was a man seriously injured along with a woman. At that point, Mrs. Smith, the first person to arrive at the scene, had already called 911. In the call, it is possible to notice that she is very desperate and asks the paramedics to arrive as soon as possible. According to some sources, the woman even tried to stop the boy's bleeding while waiting for help. According to the autopsy report performed later on his body, a single .22 caliber projectile has perforated one of his pulmonary arteries and entered one of his lungs. This, in addition to causing massive internal bleeding, made the boy unable to breathe, which ended up causing his death. Chris passed away just 2 weeks before his 23rd birthday. The young man's early and sudden departure shocked not only his family and friends, but also the residents of the city of Duncan, which, as I had already mentioned, was considered one of the safest and most peaceful places in the state of Oklahoma. During investigations, the police discovered that in addition to the crime having occurred broad daylight, it also occurred in the eyes of several people who were working nearby, and the culprits didn't even try to hide. Officers were able to speak to these witnesses, who told them they saw the moment a black 2-4-door Focus vehicle drove by Chris, and one of the occupants fired at him for no apparent reason. With this information in hand, the police decided to check the security cameras that were in the vicinity of the place where the crime occurred. In some of the images, it is possible to see the moment where Chris was running normally, and seconds later, a black Ford Focus vehicle passes right after him, going in the same direction as the boy. For the police, there was no longer any doubt that those responsible for the crime were in this vehicle, and now they needed to locate them. However, no one had written down the license plate of the car, and it was also not possible to see it on the security camera footage. With that, the officers decided to focus on street patrols to see if they could find the vehicle and get the criminals. About 4 hours later, a man who had been a witness to the crime against Chris called the police informing that a black Ford Focus vehicle was driving around that he believed it could be the criminals again. Several vehicles were quickly sent to the area, possible escape routes were closed, and in a short time, they managed to locate the vehicle and carried out the approach. Inside the car were 3 boys, named James Francis Edwards Jr., 15 years old, Chancey Aileen Luna, 16 years old, and Michael Dwayne Jones, 18 years old. Police searched the interior of the vehicle but didn't locate the murder weapon. Here, some sources say that the police found narcotics in the car, while others say that nothing illegal was found. In any case, as the 3 were prime suspects in the crime against Christopher Lane, they were taken into custody by the police department. Initially, all 3 pleaded not guilty and stated that they had no involvement in the crime. The cops didn't believe them, and after a brief investigation, they found a Twitter post by James Edwards directed at rapper Chief Keef, posted a day earlier, in which he posted lyrics from a song he composed himself, in which he said it was time to start busting people. In addition, on his social media, he had several photos with weapons, and in one of these photos he appears wearing a blue bandana on his face, something that is associated with a gang in the area called Crips. Chancey Luna and Michael Jones also had several pictures with guns and making gang symbols with their hands. In some of these pictures, they pretend to have a lot of money to look like real gangsters. Sometime later, a confession came. Michael Jones, who was behind the wheel, decided to tell the whole truth. According to the police report, he cheerfully confessed everything, saying that at the time he didn't think it was such a bad idea, that he and the others didn't think they would take someone's life with a single shot, and that he deeply regrets what he did. He said that on the day of the crime, he was driving his father's car, which he had borrowed in the morning. James Edward was in the back seat of the car packing drugs for them to use, and they knew Chancey Luna had a gun. He said they were bored, and so they had the brilliant idea of looking for a human target to test the weapon, imagined that it would be a great adventure. Chancey further confessed that they hid the murder weapon at the home of a friend named Odessa Johnson David Barnes, 21. The police went to Odessa's house to show them the place where the weapon was hidden. However, it was no longer there. Odessa was also arrested and charged with complicity, and the murder weapon was never located by the police. Well, after collecting various evidence and information about the 3 accused, the police concluded the following. The 3 boys had been friends for some time and used to do a lot of things together. On the morning of the crime, they went out for a drive and used drugs, but they were still bored. As Chancey Luna had a .22 pistol that was loaded, they decided to drive around town to look for a human target to test the weapon. That's when they spotted Chris, who was doing his morning run and little knew the sad fate that awaited him. The criminals had never seen him before. They had no idea who he was, but that didn't matter. What they wanted was to hurt someone. When the car approached Chris, Chancey pointed the gun from inside the vehicle and shot the boy in the back, who didn't have time to realize what was happening. After the crime, the boys fled the scene quickly, but not before being seen by several people who were around. They drove the car around town for a few minutes and then drove to a set of apartments where one of them lived, located on Elm Terrace, about 4 blocks from where they had committed the crime. Chris still tried to walk a few meters to call for help, and it was at that moment that Mrs. Smith saw him fall into the ground and went to help him. The criminals would have stayed about 3 hours inside the apartment and were confident, thinking that no one had seen them and that they weren't being wanted either. They then decided to go out again in search of another human target, but little did they know that a man would recognize them and call the police to report their location. In the meantime, while they were driving around with the car in search of another victim, the criminals heard on the local radio that the police were behind a black 2-door Ford Focus vehicle and that if anyone had any information about it, they should communicate the authorities. So, different from what they thought, they were indeed being sought, and so they decided it would be better to get rid of the murder weapon. The criminals went to the house of Odessa John David Barnes and asked him to hide the gun in his residence. After that, they left Odessa's house, and before they could go back to the apartment complex they were going to hide in, they were spotted by the police. And the rest of the story is what I have already narrated here. In late September 2013, James Francis Edwards Jr., Chancey Aileen Luna, and Michael Dwayne Jones were officially charged with the crime against Christopher Lane. Odessa John David Barnes was charged with complicity. In March 2015, Michael Dwayne Jones, who was the driver of the vehicle on the day of the incident, pleaded guilty and was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of applying for parole in 2051, when he will be 53 years old. Also in March 2015, Odessa John David Barnes, who disappeared with the weapon used in the crime, was found guilty of being an accomplice. He was sentenced to 12 years in prison. In April of the same year, Chancey Aileen Luna, the shooter, went on trial in Stephens County, Oklahoma. Despite all the evidence and testimony from his cronies against him, Chancey never pleaded guilty to the crime and refused every plea deal offered by the prosecution. In court, he maintained his stance and was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. In June 2016, it was James Francis Edwards Jr.'s turn to go to trial. As James was only in the car, not driving and also not carrying the gun, it was determined that he had no active involvement in the crime, but the charge of being an accessory remained. Before the court, James pleaded guilty to complicity and was sentenced to 25 years in prison, but later, 10 years were removed from the sentence, leaving 15 years for him to serve. Of these 15 years, 3 were subtracted due to the time he was already in prison, and with that, he will be released in 2029 when he's 30 years old. Michael and James were the only ones who showed regret for the crime and asked Chris' family and his girlfriend Sarah for forgiveness. However, these excuses were not accepted by the family members, who stated that anyone who takes a person's life for the simple reason of being bored doesn't deserve forgiveness. As I already mentioned, the case of Christopher Lane generated a lot of commotion and shocked the city of Duncan, which until then was considered very safe and peaceful. Chris has received numerous tributes from friends and family. His body was shipped to Australia so he could be buried in Melbourne, his hometown. According to sources, more than 150 people, including Sarah's family, college friends, and the baseball team Chris was on, took a flight from Oklahoma to Melbourne in order to attend the boys' farewell ceremony, which was marked by anger and sadness. Well, folks, that's it for today. Thanks for watching until the end. Best wishes, and I see you next time.